Okay, let's dive into something that impacts, well, pretty much all of us, especially who live in a city.
Hmm.
The reality is, we're facing more and more environmental risks. Think about those scorching heat waves or devastating floods, air pollution.
Yeah, it feels relentless sometimes.
And our cities, I mean, that's where most people live. They're really ground zero for these challenges.
They absolutely are. And this deep dive, it really gets to the heart of a crucial question, I think.
Which is?
How do our deepest beliefs about nature, like our fundamental assumptions,
Mhm.
actually shape the way we see these risks and how we manage them in cities?
Ah, okay. So it's about our underlying worldview. That's the core tension, isn't it?
Exactly.
Our sources for this exploration, they highlight two really different ways of seeing the world when it comes to nature. One is, well, centered squarely on humans,
The anthropocentric view,
right? And the other puts nature itself at the center.
ecocentrism.
Yeah.
And the research we're looking at, it describes these not just as like slightly different opinions, but as fundamentally distinct cosmovisions, entire paradigms.
Wow, okay. Big difference.
Yeah, and it explores how these visions kind of seep into our social systems, our laws, political decisions, the economy.
How they actually operate.
Exactly.
Mm.
And how that influences the way these systems even understand or communicate about and ultimately govern environmental risks right there in our cities.
Got it. So our mission today is to really unpack these two ways of seeing. Look at how they show up when faced with real urban problems.
Hmm.
And there's this really interesting research project trying to actually measure the influence of these views, which sounds fascinating.
It really is quite clever.
And then we'll think about what a real shift in perspective might involve. I mean,
I love
potentially
that.
changing everything from laws to, well, even how we feel about nature.
Yeah, it digs deep. It's about understanding those hidden assumptions that drive how we respond or maybe fail to respond to the environmental crisis.
Okay, let's get right into it then. This fundamental difference. Anthropocentrism versus ecocentrism.
Okay, so simply put, anthropocentrism is the human-centered view. Nature is seen as valuable primarily because it serves us.
Instrumental value.
Precisely. Its value comes from its usefulness to humans. And it tends to position humans as sort of separate from, maybe even above, nature.
So like a river is valuable because we get drinking water from it, or maybe power a dam for electricity.
Exactly. Or a forest is valuable for its timber, or maybe because it absorbs CO2, which benefits us.
Makes sense. So what about the other side? Ecocentrism.
Ecocentrism flips that. It sees nature as having intrinsic value, value in and of itself.
Regardless of what it does for humans.
Right. Whether it's useful to us or not, it has value simply by existing. And under this view, humans aren't separate. We're seen as part of nature, deeply interconnected within a larger system.
So that same river, it's valuable just for being a river, supporting its own fish and plants and ecosystem?
Yes. And that forest has a right to exist and thrive, just because it is a forest, a whole community of life.
Okay, those really are presented as profoundly different ways of understanding reality, not just slight tweaks.
No, not at all. And importantly, these aren't just, abstract philosophical ideas. They actively shape the world we live in.
How so?
Well, the sources point out that the foundational principles of a lot of our current structures, our legal systems, our economic models, are largely built on these anthropocentric assumptions. It's kind of the default programming.
And this default programming, this human-centered view, it runs headfirst into the reality of all these urban environmental risks we were just talking about.
Absolutely. This is where the rubber meets the road, where these different worldviews have really tangible consequences.
So what kind of risks are we talking about specifically in cities, according to the source?
Oh, it's a long list, unfortunately. Things like poor air quality, obviously. Severe heat waves, which are becoming much more common. Urban flooding, sea level rise impacting coastal cities.
Water issues too, right? Contamination or scarcity?
Definitely. Plus things like inadequate housing that makes people more vulnerable. Problems managing waste, soil contamination, noise pollution, even the spread of diseases like dengue and Zika, which are often linked to environmental changes in urban areas.
And it's not just the immediate threats to people, is it? The sources also mention bigger systemic risks from degrading the environment itself.
Yes, exactly. Things like the loss of essential ecosystem functions like pollination or water filtration, the potential collapse of local food webs, reduced natural resilience to climate shocks, food insecurity.
And even pandemics, like COVID-19.
Yeah, sources touch on that link too, how human encroachment on natural habitats can increase the risk of diseases jumping to humans. And all of this puts immense strain on health systems, infrastructure,
And looking bigger picture, you mentioned the World Economic Forum.
Right. Their 2024 Global Risks Report highlights climate events and conflict as top global risks. And both of those play out dramatically and intensely right within our cities.
Okay, so the problems are clear, they're urgent. But how do our established systems, government, law, the economy, how do they actually process these environmental warnings? The source mentions systems theory. Blue Man.
Yeah, it draws on that. The basic idea is that social systems like the legal system or the economic system, they operate based on their own internal logic, their own kind of language or frequency.
So they hear things differently.
Pretty much. The legal system processes information in terms of legality, rights, procedures. The economic system processes it in terms of profit, loss, efficiency, cost.
So a warning signal from, say, a dying river. The economy might hear potential loss of revenue, but the legal system might hear something else entirely, or maybe nothing at first.
Exactly. Or it gets translated into their specific code. The challenge is that the source is called ecological communication and achieving resonance.
Resonance.
Yeah, it's about getting those critical ecological signals, the scientific data showing pollution levels are dangerous, or an ecosystem is collapsing, to actually be heard and processed effectively within the unique logic of each social system.
So they actually register.
Right. If the signals don't resonate with the system's internal code, the warnings can get filtered out, misunderstood, or just ignored, like static.
That makes a lot of sense. And they also mention risk versus danger.
A technical distinction, maybe, but interesting. Risk is usually seen as the potential negative outcome tied to a decision we make. Danger is more like a negative outcome, not directly linked to a specific choice.
Although, with the scale of human impact now, that line must be getting pretty blurry. Are any major environmental harms purely danger anymore without some human decision involved?
That's a very good point. It gets fuzzy. The source also did something interesting. It looked at real-world data. They analyzed judgments from Brazil's Supreme Court, the STF, specifically focusing on environmental issues within cities.
Oh, cool. So seeing what the legal system is actually talking about.
Exactly. It's a way to gauge what problems are resonating enough to reach that level.
And what did they find? What topics came up most?
Well, things like environmental licensing, permits for development, also controlling pollution and urban waste. And cases explicitly dealing with urban risks, disasters, and climate change were prominent.
So those are the areas where the legal system is demonstrably engaged.
Right. It gives us a snapshot of that specific system's focus regarding cities and the environment.
Okay, this next part sounds really interesting, where things get more concrete, maybe?
Yeah.
The source describes this planned field research project. It's trying to actually measure the influence of these different worldviews.
Yes, this is fascinating stuff. The core idea, the hypothesis is, can simply changing the framing of an environmental principle, presenting it as human-centered versus nature-centered, actually change how public officials perceive and accept environmental risks in practical decision-making.
Whoa. So just changing the initial statement could shift their choices. How are they testing that?
They plan to work with groups of public officials in Brazil, specifically in Mato Grosso state. Think city council members, mayors, vice mayors, real decision makers.
Oh.
One group gets a questionnaire. It starts with a statement reflecting the standard anthropocentric view, something very similar to the current language in Brazil's constitution. Everyone has the right to an ecologically balanced environment.
Right. Focuses on the human right. Familiar.
Very familiar. Then, the other group gets the same scenarios, same questions later on, but their questionnaire starts with a radically different, ecocentrically framed statement.
Which is?
Nature has the right to ecologically balanced people.
Wow. Okay, that completely flips the script. Nature has the right, and people need to be balanced for nature.
Exactly. It puts nature's right front and center and frames human behavior in relation to fulfilling that right. It's a significant normative shift right at the beginning.
So after that framing statement, what do they ask these officials?
Both groups then evaluate various hypothetical urban development scenarios. They're shown visuals, apparently using scales, that illustrate trade-offs. For example, maybe trade-offs between building height limits and economic development, or the amount of green space preserved versus land used for agriculture or industry, or maybe levels of pollution from factories versus keeping those factories operating. They have to look at these balances and choose what they think is a reasonable point on the scale.
So essentially, they're making choices about how much environmental impact is acceptable for some perceived benefit. Right?
Precisely.
But the researchers want to see if starting with the nature has the right, statement makes officials less willing to accept high environmental impacts compared to those who started with the everyone has the right statement.
That's the core goal. To see if the ecocentric framing leads to, 1, greater sensitivity to risk, meaning they perceive more potential harm, and 2, a lower appetite for risk, meaning they're less willing to accept negative environmental impacts.
It's a really practical attempt to see if changing the underlying philosophy, even just in how you frame it, can influence actual decisions.
Exactly. Does the worldview filter actually change the choices?
And this research really underscores why cities are so central to this whole conversation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They are the point of most intense interaction, the primary interface, as the sources put it, between our human social systems and the natural systems they're embedded in.
And because of that intense interaction, democratic participation in how we govern environmental issues in cities becomes crucial.
Totally critical. The sources emphasize this, and it actually showed up as a category in that Supreme Court analysis too. Democratic participation was a theme in environmental cases related to cities.
It makes me think of Habermas, his idea of the world of life, that space where people interact, discuss, debate, try to reach some kind of consensus through communication.
Yes, commutative action. That's highly relevant here. The city is a key arena for that, especially with environmental risks, because it forces these really difficult conversations.
It's not just about the scientific facts, is it?
No, it's also about values, about fairness, about what we as a community decide is a just and sustainable way forward when facing tough trade-offs. What is a reasonable balance? That's often hammered out through public debate and participation.
Now, shifting gears just a little, the sources bring in another perspective from Luis Alberto Warrat. This seems to go beyond just systems and rational communication, maybe touching on something more emotional.
Yes, Warrat's idea of post-systemic sensitivity. He's critical of the purely rational, detached, sort of objectivist approach to law and reality, which he connects to that anthropocentric view.
Okay.
He argues that a truly deep connection to nature, and maybe a real shift in how we act, requires more than just calculation or following rules. It involves affect, desire, feeling the connection.
It's not enough just to have laws saying protect the river. We need to actually want the river to be healthy, like care about it.
That seems to be a core part of his argument. He suggests that a lasting change in our risk appetite might require an internalized desire for nature's well-being, for its intrinsic value. He talks about eco-citizenship linked to a political ecology of desire.
Political ecology of desire. Interesting phrase.
It is. It's about genuinely wanting a different kind of relationship, not just protecting nature out of calculated self-interest or obligation.
And he talks about surrealism in law, or imaginary normativity. What's that about?
Yeah, it's this idea that our legal frameworks need to become capable of imagining and incorporating things that might currently seem improbable or outside the bounds of traditional human-centered legal thinking.
Like giving rights to nature itself.
Exactly. How can law truly embrace the intrinsic value of a river or a forest, something traditionally seen as just an object or a resource? It requires stretching the legal imagination, maybe creating new kinds of norms.
Which brings us right back to that bold legal proposal mentioned in the sources, the one for Brazil.
Right, the concrete suggestion to actually change the Constitution, to embed ecocentric principles right there.
And the proposed phrasing was,
assigning the right to nature that humans be ecologically balanced. Again, a direct contrast to the current Article 225, which grants everyone the right to an ecologically balanced environment.
it's such a fundamental shift in perspective.
Yeah.
Nature holds the right, and human balance becomes the duty or the means to respect that right.
It really is. And the hope, the intention behind such a proposal is that changing the highest law of the land could start to shift the fundamental programming of the legal system itself.
Maybe ripple out.
Yes. Through a process the sources call interpenetration, the idea is it could influence how other social systems, the economy, politics, education, start to resonate with and incorporate these ecocentric principles more deeply.
Before we wrap up, the sources also briefly mention technology, specifically AI.
Yes, just a brief mention exploring the potential for artificial intelligence to act as a kind of catalyst for ecocentric communication within cities.
How might that work?
The thinking seems to be that AI could potentially help bridge gaps between different systems, maybe process vast amounts of environmental data alongside social data in new ways, helping to detect patterns or facilitate that crucial resonance between what's happening ecologically and how our social systems perceive and respond to it, making the signals clearer, perhaps.
Interesting potential there. Okay, so after diving into all of this, what's the big takeaway for you listening out there trying to navigate the world today, especially in a city?
Well, I think it really highlights that the way we fundamentally think about nature, is it just a resource for us, or does it have its own inherent value? This underlying perspective has a profound, often hidden influence
On everything.
on the environmental risk we create, the risks we accept, the solutions we consider viable, especially in our cities. It's about those deep-seated assumptions shaping our decisions, individually and collectively.
And it strongly suggests, doesn't it, that really tackling these intense urban environmental challenges, it might require more than just tweaking policies around the edges.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It could demand pretty fundamental shifts, changes in our legal foundations, like that constitutional idea, changes in how our social systems actually understand and respond to ecological realities.
And maybe the hardest part, a shift in how we actually feel about nature, cultivating that genuine desire for a balanced relationship that Warat talks about.
That might be the deepest challenge, yes. Moving beyond just obligation towards genuine care and connection. It really calls for a re-examination of our whole relationship with the living world.
So here's a final thought to chew on. We often talk about the right to the city, which usually focuses on human rights, access to housing, services, participation within the urban space. But what if we expanded that? What if we started thinking seriously about the right of the city itself, recognizing the city not just as a collection of people and buildings, but as this complex, intertwined socio-ecological system?
With its own ecological needs and perhaps even its own intrinsic value.
Exactly. If we adopted that perspective, how might it change our everyday choices, our urban planning, our collective actions in the places we call home? And maybe the biggest question, how do we actually cultivate that deeper connection, that desire for ecological balance that Warat suggests goes beyond just following the rules?
Yeah. How do we foster that feeling? That
Really?
leaves you with a lot to think about.